Hey everyone, this is Eli from Elfbait. Welcome back. Today I'm going to take a kind of a detour from my normal RPG talk to talk to you guys about kind of the other great gaming love that in some ways for many years completely eclipsed RPGs for me, and that's miniatures. So my miniatures addiction goes all the way back to almost as far back as my D&D. In fact, pretty much as far back as D&D. All the way back then, we had Citadel, Raw Partha, Martian Metals, a few other ones that were on the scene. Asgard, Bronze Age miniatures. I think if that's even what got it. There's so many members. Oh, there was Heritage back in the day. You know, I started collecting miniatures back in the early '80s, and back then we had, you know, brick and mortar stores. You go in, you have racks of just different companies, and we'd spend hours just tooling around looking for the ones we had. And even back then, we started to kind of figure out our favorites. And, you know, I had a thing for Sylvan folks, you know, elves and centaurs and things like that. And another buddy of mine was all about goblins. And so, you know, of course, later on that goes further. You know, about high school, I discovered Warhammer and Warhammer, mainly Warhammer 40K. With the old Rogue Trader book, got into that. Later on, got into Fantasy Battle. Went through the sub games of Mordheim and Necromunda, and then later on, kind of graduated onto other stuff where it became more of a hobby and less playing. I didn't really have enough time or opponents to play too many other games. I played the Clan War miniature game when it came out. Had a big old dragon army, dragon all the way. Can't go wrong with tattooed monks and a god for your clan leader. And then, you know, discovered other scales. You know, I was mainly, in the old days, there was True 25, there was just, you know, Classic 25. Warhammer kind of upped the game and got it to what we now think of as 28 millimeter, even though they've gone well beyond that in their scale. But I also just started playing around with things like 15 millimeter, and even 6 millimeter, which is also known as micro scale. Had a micro armor, Cold War German army at one point. Started doing historical war games. Really got a knack for that. I built a 8th century Greek army in 28 millimeter at one point. Ended up selling that off at one point, but just it is the other thing I do. That's gone so far that now I also have my own range of miniatures. That's Loud Ninja Games. If you ever hear of Loud Ninja Games, that's me. I sell through Alternative Armies. It's a company out of Scotland that's just, they've always done me right as far as partnership. Originally, they were just producing molds and, casting the miniatures for me. But when I decided to go full on and just kind of do this as my own sort of, right now, it's not so much of a business, but it's a side hustle, I guess you could call it, doing miniature sculpts. And doing my own range, but also I contracted some miniature ranges, did a couple of Kickstarters for those as well. So yeah, if I'm not rolling dice and coming up with tabletop RPG stuff, I'm probably doing miniature things. I like to build scenery. Not a huge fan of painting. It's not that I'm not good at it. I just would rather be making stuff. I'm more of a maker than a painter. I really need to find somebody who loves painting but hates making. So that's kind of my background as miniatures. Why am I doing this video today? Well, I wanted to talk about scales. My channel is mainly a RPG channel, but I'm kind of thinking that I might like to incorporate some more miniature stuff into it. And I figured a good place to start on that would be to talk about scale. So most RPG players know 28 millimeter. That is kind of the typical scale in which adventure miniatures are done. That's what Reaper Bones does. That's what the new stuff from WizKids coming out is. It floats either way. I mean, 28 millimeters is what we call it, but 25 millimeter is what it originally started as. They just started calling it 28 because there was scale creep, and that's a whole other topic. But a lot of RPGers, especially coming up now, are not so familiar with other scales. And part of this comes from the fact that in stores, nowadays, you almost exclusively see 28 millimeter. All the big box, big brand, glossy games are only in 28 millimeter. Well, there are some other options out there, and they kind of do different things. And I thought, why not do a primer on what it is that you can do with with your miniature scales. So after this introduction, I'm going to kind of cut away to some shots of other miniatures and just kind of talk about what it is they do. I'm going to show comparisons of the 3 primary scales at 6mm, 15mm, and 28mm next to one another. Got an assortment of different brands, including some of my own stuff in there. And then I'd like to also kind of demonstrate what it is that you can do with some of the smaller scales. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot that I can show you that you can do with 6mm. It's not a scale I play often, and I only play it for very specific things. But I do have some 15mm stuff that is, I think, shows off nicely what you can do in this scale in terms of display and detail of miniatures. I'm not a great painter, so what you're seeing painted here, do apologize, may not be as good as some of the stuff you've seen, but I do my best. And I paint to what I call table scale, which is it's going to look good at 3 feet away from the table where you're going to see it. There's no real reason to get insane with playing miniatures unless you are also really going to focus on displaying them. So let me go ahead and end it there, and I'll jump to another shot, and we'll take a look, and I'll kind of go over comparison of scale and then go into showing you some of the details. And as I do this, I do want to talk about what these scales are best for and what you can do for, though these are my opinions and they're not exclusive. There is some bleed over, so I'll talk about that in a minute. Check with me. I'll be right back.
All right, let me see if I can get these into this shot here. Okay, so what do I got here? So from the left to the right, we've got 28mm figures in various shapes and forms, because when we're talking about scale, we're talking about human scale, but I wanted to show how other things scale against it and the variation in scale. So we got 28mm on the left and 15mm on the right, and in the foreground there we've got 6mm. So as you can see, there's some distinct size difference, and that's of course, because they represent different scales. So on the left, we've got, I believe that is we got a chimpanzee, and I gotta say the manufacturer escapes me. Then there is a figure from Copplestone, which I've painted to be the man in the yellow hat. Yes, that's supposed to be Curious George and the man in the yellow hat. I use them for pulp adventure games to be kind of a tongue-in-cheek adventure team. There is a Viking there in the middle with his great axe held aloft. That is from the sadly now defunct Wargames Factory miniatures line. Great line of multi-part plastics. If you see in the background all that other gray and green, that's my sculpting. It's a sea of projects that are all work in progress. So going into the 15mm, I've got 2 figures there that I have sculpted. One right there with the yellow mask, that is a Wasteland Shaman that I've painted, that I sculpted and then painted for my line at Loud Ninja Games. And then, and the focus may go in and out of this, but I do apologize. To the right of that is a Prang. The Prang are large frog-type aliens that I sculpted for Alternative Armies. They're part of the Ion Age universe. That is kind of Gavin over there at Ion Age. That's his pet project, and actually a science fiction game with almost as old a pedigree, if not as old a pedigree, as Warhammer 40k. I remember actually seeing the earliest miniatures coming out from Alternative Armies for them shortly after I started seeing Rogue Trader stuff. But he now does it in 15mm as well as 28mm, and so this is a race that I've sculpted. You'll notice that that figure is bigger than a human, and they're supposed to be. They're big, bloaty frog guys who are just really badass. To the right of that is a alien who I think that's the Vleda, and they're from Blue Moon Manufacturing. Blue Moon Manufacturing is a sub-label for Old Glory miniatures. And to the right of that is a conversion, and this is something that a lot of people may be familiar with from 28mm, like the man in the yellow hat there. I mean, I modified the hat to make it look more like the Curious George character, but this character on the right here for the 15mm, that is a old Battlefront miniatures. Before they actually released the Flames of War line, they had an existing line of historical miniatures. Old Battlefront miniatures, German with a Panzerfaust that's been converted into a sci-fi trooper. Now the foreground here, these are actually figures that I sculpted as well. These were sculpted for Alternative Armies, but they were originally sculpted as mecha to go with fleet scale ships. Now, fleet scale is a term that you might hear me drop, and what that really denotes is sort of an undisclosed actual scale that represents spaceships. It is designed for battle fleets and space fleets, and these were space fleet mecha instead of fighters. A lot of times you'll have fighter figures, and I wanted to do some mecha. Normally I would put these on flight bases, but somebody had asked me how they would look as 6mm power armor, and that's what you're seeing here. So those are about the height of your typical armored 6mm figure. And when we're talking about the millimeters, there is some debate as to what it actually calculates to, but I believe the most generally accepted is that the millimeter scaling is roughly the height from the bottom of the foot, not the bottom of the base, but the bottom of the foot of the figure to the eye level. You wouldn't sculpt these scales to the top of the head because that can vary based on headgear and stuff, but we're talking about human scale and how it relates to the perspective of the figure. Now those scales are kind of hard to calculate into true modeling scales. You may be familiar with modeling scales like 1/72 or 1/56 or 1/35. So roughly 28mm will fit in, depending on the manufacturer and the model, with like 1/48 scale, 1/56 scale. 15mm is kind of roughly 1/100th scale, and 6mm comes in at about 1/285th or 1/300th scale, depending on what manufacturer you're going with. But the 6mm, 15mm, 28mm, 25mm, 10mm, all those other, when you hear them talking about millimeters, those are scales that are used almost exclusively amongst miniatures producers to set them aside from actual scale modelers. So where might you use these scales? So, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, 28mm is most frequently associated with adventure miniatures. Small scale adventure miniatures where you're doing a party of adventurers or encounters. It is really good as a scale where individual character matters, but it's not exclusive to that. Warhammer uses 28mm, and so certainly that's considered kind of a mid to large army scale. A lot of historical players, you will fill tables with 28mm, and again, it's really the scale to use if you're looking to get a good amount of detail on a figure, but still have room on the table. Now, 15mm has its origins in economy of scale, but newer manufacturing and just new artistry that's gone into it has really brought the level of detail in 15mm up. 15mm used to be pretty vague and was pretty basic in its details, and that kind of goes back to just way back when the manufacturing wasn't as good, and so it could often have trouble in detail. But nowadays it's pretty much it can be on par with 28mm. I have seen some 15mm figures that have been painted up and were absolutely indistinguishable from 28mm. But the primary advantage of 15mm is in terms of game scale and tabletop economy or table economy, space economy. If you take the same force, same number of figures for 28mm and 15mm and put them on the same board, you will have a lot more room to maneuver with your 15mm. So this makes 15mm ideal for a couple of reasons in that regard. You can, like I said, you can take the same size force and get more table space, which allows you more room to maneuver and allows for more complexity of play and tactics and strategy. Or what it's also really great at is playing larger forces. So while an army in 28mm may look like a force, like if you were to take the same table, let's go with say the standard kind of the industry bog standard 4x8 gaming table, which is a good scale for miniatures gaming, and you were to put 28mm figures on there, you would have a force that would look like probably a good size force of a particular lord or a combination of lords for like a medieval army. But you could fit like the king's army in 15mm on there reasonably. In terms of more modern combat, 28mm is really great for squad on squad, maybe maxing out at a platoon. 15mm, you can get a platoon on there easy. You could even get up to a company of infantry and still have room to maneuver. The one really cool thing about 15mm that I particularly love, and this comes true in science fiction miniatures gaming, where the troopers are just as cool or just as important as the machines, but the machines themselves are super important as well, is it's a heck of a lot easier to get vehicles on the table and still be able to use them in a useful and realistic fashion. In 28mm, they become huge chunks of scenery, and while they can move around the table, it's just really hard to have more than one or two vehicles on there without looking ridiculous. I mean, if you look at Warhammer tables, for example, Warhammer 40,000 tables, those tables will often have a dozen so vehicles, and it looks like a parking lot. So getting down to 6mm, now 6mm is really the scale for playing super large scale armies. If you're wanting to play like Napoleonic armies, or you wanted to do a one trooper for one trooper representation of the Battle of Hastings, this is your scale. You're going to be able to get so many figures on the board that you can honestly start approaching real world army sizes in their entirety. And I apologize for the shaky camera. Sorry. But you're going to get close to real world troop formation sizes and still have room for movement. When you're playing Micro Armor, which is 1/300 scale, modern or World War II combat and stuff, or even sci-fi, you really actually get a good scale, a good area to move in. When you're using 6mm, if you take that 4x8 gaming table, not only do you have the town, but you have the countryside surrounding it. You might even fit two nearby villages in a medieval board. On a 4x8 table, it would be easy enough to have the castle of the realm on one corner, have the associated village, and maybe even like the associated monastery all on the same board, and still have it look believable, and certainly, and give you some really cool tactical options. So those are the three primary scales. Now, I don't want to make this. I don't want to delude anybody or deceive anybody. There are other scales. There's 10mm, which falls between 6 and 15. And while 10mm is pretty common, I feel like it's a scale that was created in my mind. It's a scale that was created to maybe allow for a slight adjustment in table economy. Between 15mm and 28mm, of course, there's the old school scale of True 25, which is what you had back in the late 70s and 80s, with D&D figures from Ralpartha and Citadel. Modern skirmish level miniatures or small army miniature, small size force miniatures are actually coming out even in like 32 and like 48mm or 40mm. It's kind of a weird scale creep, and scale creep is a thing. Scale creep is the slow increase of size of miniatures in a particular scale until they start talking about new scales. 28mm is actually an expression of accepted scale creeps. 28mm was really a slow size increase on 25mm that has just become the acceptable. It's often referred to as heroic scale, although now heroic scale tends to be thought of as more like 32mm. Now, there's even figures smaller than 6mm, and I actually have those, but I didn't put them on camera because it really is pointless. Although, if you want to actually wait a moment, maybe I can actually pull one out here and show you. I've got a formation of 6mm figures. These are actually Martians that I did for a kind of Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter type of a setting. So I'm going to slide these in here, and you'll be able to see these. This is a formation of Martians. Now, as you can see, and let me get this in focus here, those are freaking tiny. But on that one base, there's probably pushing, 60 or 80 men. So that is 2 millimeter. That is an insanely small scale. At that point, you're actually getting to where your figures are in scale with small, are scaled to where you can fit small gunboats on the when I say gunboats, I mean like destroyer class naval vessels on a board and not have it look janky. They can get small and they get bigger. I mean, certainly 28 millimeter is like I said, it's a scale. It's not an absolute size definition. So I'm going to pull in another figure from the background here, and I'm going to pan up. You can see the cork and you see the feet there. But if I pull the camera up, this is something I'm in the process of sculpting. This is actually what I call a dump sculpt. This is actually a sculpture that I put together with leftover bits of putty. Often when I'm working on a project, I may get the work I'm needing to do done, and I'll have leftovers, and so I will put it onto this thing. This is some big funky mutant thing. So that is a figure that is technically what we call scale neutral. Now, a scale neutral figure is something that really works in multiple scales. If I hold up my Viking, then right now we've got kind of a big ogre-sized, Grendel-y thing that would be a, like a heroic enemy. Now, if I put a 15 millimeter figure next to this guy, suddenly we've got a giant. We're talking a giant. Where this is a human-sized figure. This haggy kind of wasteland, post-apocalyptic shaman. She's slightly shorter than a regular human. It's a kind of a giant. Now, if we were to put 6 millimeter in against this, imagine that you're doing if these were like medieval knights. You've got a giant, huge titanic chaos beast or something. So this is something that I would often refer to as scale neutral. Until I actually start putting specific details onto that thing, like equipment, it kind of remains neutral. You can see it in the background there, next to this kind of pigeony thing and stuff. So back to the original framing. So again, we've got 28 millimeter on the left, which is your scale that's really good for skirmish level, which is going to be small squads or smaller armies. 15 millimeter, which really lends itself well to mid-size, to just the low end of large-style forces. And then you've got 6 millimeter, which is really best for large scale. You're not going to get a lot of detail on 6 millimeter, at least on the infantry, though you can get a decent amount. So that is sort of the breakdown of the scales, what you can do with them. I focused on infantry figures here. Maybe I'll do another, I'll showcase some vehicles later on another video, just so you can see what they look like. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of the breakdown of how the infantry figures or the trooper figures might be used in different scales. So I'm going to go ahead and cut over to another frame here in a moment, just to show you some of the detail and fun you can have with small scale, just to kind of give an example of what this 15 millimeter stuff can look like if you really want to play with it. I do a lot with 15 millimeter, and I think 28 millimeter has really, most people talking miniatures has probably seen quite a bit of 28 millimeter, because quite frankly, that's what's out there. So you've probably all seen those brilliant Warhammer tables, or those massive historical castles, or those awesome fantasy boards using the Dwarven Forge stuff, or whatever scenery manufacturer they're using. But I want to show you what you can do with some 15 millimeter. So I'll be right back with another shot. Alright, so I am back. Let me go ahead and get these into frame here. And what I've got here are two figures from my collection. These are both examples of adding scenery to a base to kind of stage and frame your figure. And I apologize for the lighting. The lighting at my table may be a little weird. Let me turn on my overhead and see if that helps. If not, I'll turn it back off. But not a bit. All right, so we'll go ahead and get rid of that. So on the left here is a miniature from my company, Loud Ninja Games, and this is a Chewok. That's a Space Velociraptor. This is a sniper that I have I have painted and put into scenery. He's in a sniper position. We've got some rocks and some branches and some leaves. And I know the focus is going to go in and out here, but it's trying. My finger's getting in the way. But if I pull in here, maybe I can get these guys a little bit better by putting them center frame. Just a second. And can I get these to come in? There we go. All right. So as you can see, we got leaf litter and stuff on the Chewok. He blends into the scenery. It's an example of a very scenic base. Now the monster on the right, this is actually a figure I sculpted. It's not available in my range. This is actually a one-off that I did, sort of a super zombie or super mutant. He's kind of generic in what he could be used for, but I've got him on a base that's very different from the other base, but it's still got some scenery elements. If you look here in the front, we got this pipe that's sort of buried in the sand. And they've got a barrel sticking out of the sand. And you can see his back's got all sorts of, harsh details. Now, he is a big 15mm figure. He's like an ogre-sized 15mm figure. The Chewok to the left is, the Space Raptor to the left. This guy is much more akin. I'll turn him this way so you can see the actual dude a little bit better. He's much more human-sized, though he is a Velociraptor. So he's not Velociraptor, he's a raptor. Velociraptors are turkey-sized, but he is a Space Raptor. He is bigger than you would see than a human, but still, if I bring in my human figure from before and put her between these two, this is the Wasteland Shaman again. You can see, let me pull out here, you can see how she stacks up against these two figures. We got the kind of ogre-sized monstrosity on the right, and a roughly human-sized figure just with an alternate geometry on the left. You can't really see him through the camouflage, but that means the camouflage is working. The reason I wanted to bring these in here is to show that you can still stage, even at smaller scales, you can kind of show off figures with a decent amount of scenery and artistry. Even the figure in the center is using some pre-made tufts of turf, tufts of foliage, to liven up what is otherwise just a very sandy base. And you could throw pieces of rock and stuff on there and get that. And so you can definitely get some pretty cool stuff out of these. So I know I talked about vehicles, and I'm not going to get it too heavy into vehicles here. And I wanted to show just kind of how you kind of give an idea of what the table economy is. If you look at that square that this figure is standing on, that is a 2-inch square. Actually, excuse me, it's about 1.5 inches square. Oops, got her out of frame. So it's about 1.5 inches square. So I'm going to pull in a figure that I did from the background here. This is actually a scratch-built battle robot that I made. This is really kind of a rough model, but it was just a kind of proof of concept, a real quick and dirty build. I like to do a lot of this. But this is for my own games. This is not something that I produce for sale or anything. But this is just built with beads and model parts, and this is an example of just how big of a model, how big of a vehicle you can get on the board and still have a lot of room. If I was to put this on a 4x8 gaming table, as you can see based on that table grid on that grid mat, you've got a good amount of space left for. I mean, this monster, this robot here only takes, a good, 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches. Don't actually have the grid measured, but so I mean, it's easy to see where that scale economy would come from. If I was to put a 28mm vehicle on there, it would take a lot of room. 28mm vehicles tend to be almost three of these grid squares. 6 to 8 inches is not uncommon. Excuse me, for a small vehicle for 28mm. So again, you can kind of see how that economy comes into into play. I mean, here's that ogre-sized mutant. He's still big, but he's nowhere near as big as that vehicle. So table economy is one of the big benefits of 15 millimeter, but nowadays that doesn't necessarily mean you're sacrificing detail and artistry in your figure. I mean, you can get a lot of cool little scenery in there, and you can do a lot. And you can see on this creature here, dry brushing and highlighting, as much as you can see it with this bad light, can give a lot of detail. There's a lot of sinew and bone structure and stuff in that, and so you're really not necessarily losing anything with 15 millimeter. Now, why isn't 15 millimeter used for more games? I think that's because really when it comes down to it, in the circles where 28 millimeter is used, it still doesn't compete. I mean, there's nothing like seeing every link of chainmail. There's nothing like seeing every detail on the belt buckles, you know, the runes on the sword. I mean, while you can get some of that in 15 millimeter, it's never going to look as good as it does in 28 millimeter. So 28 millimeter is definitely the choice of figures for adventure, and you know, and for those close-in skirmish stuff, skirmish games. So it's definitely the type of stuff you're going to want. It's going to be more prevalent in D&D figures and in skirmish games, or you know, historical war games, where a lot of times what they're trying to show off is the pageantry and the uniforms of the army that they're depicting. So one last thing I do want to mention, though, is it is very easy to do a dungeon crawl with 15 millimeter figures. There's a wide variety of fantasy figures for 15 millimeter. I don't have as many of those as I do science fiction figures, so I really don't have much to display. But you know, if we go back to the kind of the basic, you know, ratios that we're talking about before, you know, 15 millimeter is roughly about half the size of 28 millimeter. So if you figure you got a dungeon that you're building, or dungeon tiles that you're building for your game, the dungeon tiles that you're going to build in 28 millimeter are going to be a hell of a lot more effective, and in terms of table economy, you'll be able to get bigger dungeon crawls, or the same dungeon in a smaller place. Maybe you just have a coffee table to play on, or a little, you know, breakfast table. 15 millimeter may be the way to go. There's plenty of adventurers and monsters out there. Nice thing about 15 millimeter too is you can scale up monsters. It's really easy to take, say, like a 28 millimeter ogre, or even like one of the Neanderthals from Underworld Miniatures, you know, that they have. That could make a really solid hill giant in 15 millimeter. And there you go. You've got your dungeon crawlers, you got your adventurers, you've got your scenery. You know, just when you're dealing with the smaller scales, you can definitely build out more. So that's something to consider. So I'm going to go ahead and cut away from this. Next thing you're going to see is my ugly mug, and I'll go over some closing remarks here. But just a moment.
All right, so we're back. And so that was kind of an in brief on miniatures. And gonna kind of cap the glue here. I actually had a bit of a breakage between scenes, but it's all good. So miniature scale is not an exact science, and certainly nothing is specifically locked into miniatures. Like so much else in gaming, it's really how you choose to use it. While something in a tabletop adventure may be designed with a particular story or theme in mind, there's nothing to say that you can't borrow that and take it into another game. Miniatures are the same. Scale neutrality is something I mentioned, but there's also things like upscaling and downscaling, and we do this a lot in miniatures to widen the palette of available miniatures. A 28 millimeter creature can become an even larger creature in 15 millimeter. At the same time, though, a large creature in 15 millimeter can still be used as a decent sized miniature in 28 millimeter. A good example is in one of the recent Reaper Bones lines that was made. They had a collection of small, like, hatchling dragons, you know, and those hatchling dragons while small by 28 millimeter standards, made really good like young adult dragons in 15 millimeter. Now, you'll see things like 15 millimeter dinosaurs, which there's no equipment on them and stuff, so they really scale up as well. The biggest thing that's going to keep things from scaling one way or the other is going to be equipment, and often that can be disguised as well. I have taken 28 millimeter giants, covered over some of their more scale obvious equipment, and made them, bigger figures in 15 millimeter, and also, kind of the other direction. A large 15 millimeter giant can become sort of an ogre in 28 millimeter. But it comes down to how you want to use it. It's just a matter of what's out there. But keeping an eye for flexibility in scale, keeping an eye on multiple scales will greatly increase what you can use. And sometimes the figures that are made in a specific scale may actually do a better job for another scale than the figures that are made in that scale. I've seen some 15 millimeter kobolds, for example, that are a little big for 15 millimeter kobolds, but they really work well for tiny 28 millimeter kobolds. So you got that as well. Vehicles can be rescaled by covering up details like windows and doors, or sometimes it's just a matter of repainting them, painting them differently. It's a very tactile hobby, unlike your RPGs, where the most tactile element of them is usually the figure you're pushing around, or your character sheet, or your books you're working with. Miniatures is incredibly tactile. I would say, if you're worried about space of storage and stuff, look at a different scale than 28 millimeter, or look at scaling back to small collections. Painting does not need to be a huge issue when you're buying unpainted figures. There are lots of pre-painted figures out there. I'm not a fan of pre-painted figures, simply because I've spent some time painting my own stuff, and I know with a minimum amount of work, I can usually accomplish a degree of paint work that is equal to or better than the pre-painted miniatures, and I'm usually going to be paying less for an unpainted miniature. That's my opinion, that's my preference, but kind of where I was going with that is painting is not that difficult if you follow some basic steps. There's plenty of videos out there on painting, but keep in mind, if you're painting for your table, you don't need to have it be museum quality. Nobody's grading you, and honestly, 4 colors on a goblin on the table, especially when it's a placeholder for your RPG, is going to look plenty good. You got skin, clothing, weapons, and a few detailed colors. Even Games Workshop, for their tournament rules, requires only 3 colors. And you can get a long way with 3 colors, especially in armored figures. Metal for armor and weapons, 1 color for the tunic, 1 color for the skin. Maybe your skin and your leather on the figure are the same color. You just do a dry brush of a lighter color over the skin. Or maybe you have a dark skinned figure. It's cool. It doesn't matter, especially when you're dealing with monsters. But humans come in all shades and colors as well, so it works easily there. Don't be intimidated by feeling the need to paint to a museum quality if you're just going to be gaming with miniatures. Okay, so that was a lot of video. Hopefully this helped those who may not be as familiar with miniatures see what's out, see kind of the idea, or get an idea for what is out there, and what the different scales of miniatures equate to and how they can be used. There's no law book that says how you have to use them, but where do you buy them? It's miniatures, like I mentioned earlier, 28 millimeters is about all you're going to see in most brick and mortars nowadays, except for things like X-Wing figures and stuff like that, which are totally their own scale. I think there's 1/270th or something like that. Or Armada, which is a fleet scale game, although it's a very large fleet scale game. Point being is that other figures that you're going to find, this is one last point, when you're buying miniatures, if you buy based on what is available at your brick and mortar, or in the mainstream catalogs, you're going to be very limited. However, if you do searches for 28 millimeter and then whatever you're looking for, or 15 millimeter and whatever you're looking for, or even just Dragon miniature or Dragon gaming miniature, you're going to find a lot more options than Games Workshop, Privateer Press, Reaper, and some of the mainstream ones. There's a lot of companies out there that do historical figures that can be subbed in for fantasy figures. I mean, fantasy is usually couched in history, so it's really easy, for example, to buy a 28 millimeter barbarian and historical barbarian and use them as a fantasy barbarian. Generic spearmen, like infantry spearmen, make great city guards. And historical figures, often you can buy a bag of figures for pushing just a little over $1 a figure. You might have to paint them, but the detail is going to be better than some of the pre-painted, some of the plastics. And you'll have a wide variety of them. Now, you're probably not going to need a bag of 30 guys if all you're doing is buying City Guard. But City Guard you can paint some of them as City Guard, then some of them as militia, some of them as King's Men. There's some options there. I could go on forever about this topic. It's something I love. So if you have questions, please throw them down below. If you need more info or you want to see me do videos on some other stuff, by all means, chime in. I'm happy to talk about it. Go ahead and post over on Elfbait Facebook group over on on Facebook. That was cumbersome, but yes, there's a Facebook group for Elfbait. But also, I'm on Twitter. I'm Elfbait on Twitter. And also, if you want to email me directly, go ahead and shoot me an email at baittheelf@gmail.com, and you can go ahead and get responses from me, or if you have a suggestion for a video there. I will leave links to some of the companies that I mentioned in the video in the description, and hopefully this was helpful for you. As always, do get out in game, whether that's rolling dice with a tabletop RPG, or maybe you're not going to push some lead and have yourself a good miniatures game. Have a good one.